The warehouse smells of olive oil and sweat and fear. The year is approximately 146 years before the Common Era, 3 weeks after the fall of Corinth, and the woman standing in the processing chamber was, until 23 days ago, the wife of a Greek aristocrat whose family had governed this city for 6 generations. Her name is Cleomache. She is 31 years old. She speaks 4 languages, can quote Homer from memory, has managed a household of 40 servants, has negotiated trade agreements on her husband's behalf, has raised 3 children who are now somewhere in this same warehouse complex, separated from her during the initial sorting that followed the city's capture. She does not know where her children are. She has not seen them since the 2nd day after the walls fell. She does not know if they are alive. What she knows is that she is standing naked in a room with 11 other women, all of them from families that once commanded respect throughout the Greek world, all of them now property of a Roman slave dealer named Gaius Varius Flaccus, all of them being prepared for an auction that will take place in 3 days in the forum of what was once their city. She can feel the cold of the stone floor beneath her bare feet, can feel the eyes of the dealer's assistants as they move among the women with measuring ropes and wax tablets, documenting height and weight and the specific dimensions that Roman buyers will want to know. She can smell the oil that has been rubbed into her skin to make it shine under the auction torches, can taste the bitter residue of the purgative she was forced to drink this morning to empty her bowels before the physical examination that will happen within the hour. She can see the implements arranged on the wooden table against the far wall, razors and pumice stones, cosmetic pots containing substances she does not recognize, thin metal instruments whose purposes she can guess but does not want to confirm, chains and collars in various sizes waiting to be fitted to necks that once wore gold and jewels. The man who owns her now, the dealer Varius Flaccus, enters the room and surveys his merchandise with the professional eye of someone who has processed thousands of human beings through facilities exactly like this one. He has been in the slave trade for 27 years. He has purchased captives from a dozen conquered peoples. He knows exactly what Roman buyers want, exactly how to prepare merchandise to maximize sale prices, exactly what techniques transform resistant noblewomen into compliant products suitable for the most discerning households. He looks at Cleomache with an appraising gaze that makes her feel less than the furniture in her former home. At least, furniture was valued for what it was, while she is being valued only for what she can be made to become. "This one," he says to his chief assistant, gesturing toward her, "she still has her pride. I can see it in how she stands. 3 days is enough time to address that. Begin with the standard protocol. If she remains difficult, we will move to the advanced techniques." What happens to Cleomache over the next 3 days, and what happened to tens of thousands of women like her across centuries of Roman conquest, is what tonight's video will reveal. This is not the Rome of marble temples and philosophical debates. This is the Rome of the slave markets, where human beings were processed like commodities, where captured noblewomen were systematically broken before being sold, where techniques refined over generations transformed the proudest women of conquered nations into merchandise that Roman buyers would find acceptable. This is what the slave dealers did. This is what the historical sources document. This is what you were never taught. What you are about to learn has been sanitized out of most educational accounts of Roman civilization, because the reality contradicts the image of Rome as a foundation of Western culture and values. You know about Roman slavery in the abstract. You have heard that Romans kept slaves, that slavery was common in the ancient world, that the economy of the Roman Republic and Empire depended on enslaved labor. You may have encountered the more dramatic aspects of Roman slavery in popular culture: gladiators, fighting in arenas, slaves rowing in galleys, the famous rebellion of Spartacus. But you have never learned what actually happened to the people who became Roman slaves. You have never heard about the processing facilities where captured populations were sorted, evaluated, and prepared for sale. You have never encountered the detailed accounts that Roman writers left of how slave dealers operated, how they selected and processed their merchandise, how they transformed free people into commodities through systematic techniques designed to break resistance and create compliance. Tonight you will discover what the Roman sources themselves reveal about the slave trade that enriched Rome for centuries. You will learn about the mangones, the professional slave dealers who purchased captives from military commanders and processed them for retail sale. You will learn about the specific techniques these dealers used to prepare noblewomen for auction techniques, documented in Roman legal texts, mentioned in Roman literature, described in sources that scholars have known about for centuries, but that popular education continues to ignore. You will learn about Cleomache of Corinth, who was 31 years old when her city fell, and who spent 3 days in processing before being sold to a household in Rome. About Berenice of Carthage, who was the daughter of a senator in that city, and who was separated from her children during the destruction that followed the Third Punic War. About Theodora of Macedon, who was a priestess before her capture, and who was specifically targeted for preparation techniques designed to destroy her religious identity. About Arsinoe of Pontus, who attempted to resist the processing and discovered what the dealers did to women who did not cooperate. You will learn these things from Roman sources, from legal texts that regulated the slave trade, from literary works that described it, from archaeological evidence that confirms it. The Romans documented what they did because they did not consider it shameful. They wrote about slave processing the way they wrote about agriculture or manufacturing as a business practice, with established methods and professional standards. Subscribe if you want to understand what Roman civilization actually looked like for the millions of people who were processed through its slave markets. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because Cleomache is standing in that processing facility in Corinth, and Varius Flaccus has just ordered his assistants to begin the standard protocol, and I am going to tell you exactly what that protocol involved, what the dealers did, what the women experienced, and what the evidence reveals about practices that transformed free people into property. But first, I need to explain how these women came to be in the dealers' hands at all. Roman military conquest followed patterns that remained consistent across centuries of expansion. When a city fell, whether through assault, siege, or surrender under unfavorable terms, the population became property of the Roman state, to be disposed of according to the commander's judgment and the Senate's instructions. The disposition typically followed a predictable sequence. Military-age men were often killed or enslaved for labor-intensive work in mines, quarries, and agricultural operations. Children were separated from parents and processed as a distinct category of merchandise. And women, particularly women of noble or wealthy families, were identified, sorted, and transferred to professional slave dealers who specialized in preparing high-value human merchandise for sale. The identification of noblewomen happened quickly, usually within hours of a city's fall. Roman officers had standing instructions to secure valuable captives before the general looting could disperse or damage them. Soldiers who captured noblewomen could expect bounties that exceeded what ordinary captives would bring, creating incentive for rapid identification and protection of high-value merchandise. The criteria for identification were straightforward. Clothing and jewelry indicated wealth, soft hands and unmarked skin indicated freedom from manual labor, bearing and speech patterns indicated education, household staff, who could be interrogated, indicated social position. Within hours of capture, Roman officers could sort a city's female population into categories corresponding to expected sale prices. Cleomache was identified during the sack of Corinth by her clothing fine wool, dyed with expensive Tyrian purple, and by the gold jewelry she was wearing when soldiers broke into her home. She was seized along with her 3 children and approximately 40 servants, all of whom were held together initially before being sorted by category and transferred to different dealers based on their expected market value. The dealer Gaius Varius Flaccus purchased Cleomache and 11 other noblewomen from the military authorities approximately 6 days after Corinth's fall. The purchase price is not recorded, but similar transactions from this period suggest he paid between 2,000 and 5,000 denarii per woman, a substantial investment that he expected to recover several times over through careful preparation and skilled marketing. The women were transported from the military holding facility to Varius Flaccus's processing warehouse in a covered cart that prevented them from seeing where they were going and prevented anyone outside from seeing them. This concealment was standard practice. Dealers protected their merchandise from environmental damage, sun, rain, the eyes of competitors who might try to assess the quality of new stock, and from the psychological impact of witnessing the destruction of their former cities. By the time Cleomache arrived at the processing facility, she had not seen sunlight for approximately 14 hours. She had not eaten for approximately 20 hours. She had not seen her children for approximately 72 hours, and she had no idea what was about to happen to her. Roman slave dealers operated facilities that combined the functions of warehouse, workshop, and preparation center. The archaeological evidence from sites like Delos, the major slave trading center of the late Republic, reveals complexes containing holding cells, bathing facilities, examination rooms, and display areas, arranged in sequences that suggest systematic processing of human merchandise. The facility where Cleomache was processed was typical of its kind. The holding area consisted of cells approximately 8 feet by 8 feet, each designed to contain 2 to 4 captives, depending on their category and value. High-value noblewomen were typically held in smaller groups to minimize conflict and injury that might reduce their market price. The bathing facilities included both cold and heated pools, with adjacent rooms for oil application, hair removal, and cosmetic treatment. These facilities were not luxury accommodations. They were processing stations where human beings were cleaned, groomed, and prepared according to standardized procedures designed to present merchandise in optimal condition. The examination rooms were equipped for thorough physical assessment. Measuring instruments documented height, weight, and proportions. Medical implements allowed dealers to assess internal health in ways that the Roman legal sources describe with clinical precision. Light sources were positioned to reveal skin conditions, scars, or other defects that might affect value. The display areas were designed to present merchandise to potential buyers. Rotating platforms allowed inspection from all angles. Chains and restraints positioned bodies in standard poses that buyers expected. Lighting was arranged to highlight favorable features and minimize unfavorable ones. Varius Flaccus's facility in Corinth was a temporary installation. The conquest had created a sudden surplus of high-value captives that exceeded the capacity of permanent facilities in the region. But even this temporary facility followed the established patterns, because the techniques that worked in permanent markets worked equally well in conquest situations. Cleomache entered this facility on the 14th day after her capture. She would remain in processing for 3 days before being moved to the display area for auction. What happened during those 3 days followed protocols that Varius Flaccus had refined across 27 years in the trade. The first stage of processing was assessment, a thorough evaluation of each captive's physical condition, psychological state, and market potential. This assessment determined which preparation techniques would be applied and how the merchandise would be positioned for sale. For Cleomache, the assessment began within hours of her arrival at the facility. She was brought to an examination room where she was required to remove whatever clothing she still wore in her case. a simple tunic that had replaced her finer garments during transport. The requirement to stand naked before strangers, male assistants who showed no reaction to her nudity except professional evaluation, was itself part of the assessment, revealing how captives responded to the loss of physical privacy that their former status had protected. The physical examination that followed was comprehensive. Her height was measured and recorded. Her weight was estimated by experienced handlers who had learned to judge mass by observation. Her proportions were documented: the relationship of limb length to torso, the measurements of waist and hip and bust, the specific dimensions that Roman buyers used to evaluate merchandise. Her skin was examined for scars, birthmarks, blemishes, or signs of disease. Her hair was evaluated for thickness, length, and condition. Her teeth were inspected for decay or damage. Her hands were examined for calluses or other evidence of manual labor. Their softness confirmed her status as a noblewoman who had never worked with her hands. The examination then became more invasive. Medical procedures assessed her internal health and her physical history in ways that the Roman legal texts describe as standard practice for high-value merchandise. A dealer who sold a woman without disclosing relevant physical conditions could face legal liability, so thorough examination was both good business practice and legal protection. The Roman jurist Ulpian, writing approximately 3 centuries after Cleomache's time, describes the information that dealers were legally required to disclose. The seller must declare if the slave is diseased, defective, a runaway, or liable to punishment. The same applies to female slaves. If she has physical conditions affecting her capacity for service, the buyer must be informed. The clinical language of legal texts like this conceals the human experience of being examined like livestock by strangers who cared only about your market value. Cleomache stood through this examination in silence, her face showing nothing of what she felt, her body responding to the handler's directions with the minimum compliance necessary to avoid being forced. The psychological assessment happened simultaneously with the physical examination. How did the captive respond to commands? Did she comply immediately or hesitate? Did she show fear, anger, resignation, or resistance? Did she attempt to cover herself? Or had she already accepted that her body was no longer her own to protect? The assessment notes for Cleomache, as reconstructed from similar documented cases, would have read something like, female, approximately 30 years, Greek, formerly of noble status. Physical condition, excellent, no visible defects, good proportions, evidence of previous children. Psychological condition, resistant but controlled, shows pride in bearing, likely to require intensive preparation before market presentation. The phrase, likely to require intensive preparation, was significant. It determined which protocols would be applied over the following days. The second stage of processing was physical preparation, transforming the captive's appearance to meet Roman market expectations. This preparation varied by category and expected sale position, but for noblewomen destined for household service in wealthy Roman homes, the standards were specific and demanding. For Cleomache, physical preparation began on the morning of her second day in the facility. The first procedure was bathing, thorough cleaning, using water, oils, and abrasive substances designed to remove not just dirt, but any residue of her former life. The symbolism was deliberate. The woman who emerged from the bathing process was supposed to be clean in ways that went beyond the physical, stripped of the contamination of her previous identity, prepared to receive whatever identity her new owner would assign. The bathing was not gentle. Assistants scrubbed her skin with cloths and pumice, removing dead cells and creating a surface that would absorb the oils and cosmetics that followed. They washed her hair with solutions that stripped natural oils before applying treatments that would make it shine. They cleaned every part of her body, with a thoroughness that left no area private or protected. The hair removal followed. Roman aesthetic preferences favored minimal body hair on female slaves, particularly those destined for household display. The removal process used razors, pumice, and resinous substances that pulled hair out by the roots, a painful process that the Roman poet Ovid describes in terms that suggest the experience was unpleasant, even for free women who chose it voluntarily. For captives who did not choose it, the hair removal served additional purposes beyond aesthetics. It was a physical assertion of the dealer's control over the captive's body, a demonstration that what had been private was now subject to commercial requirements. The pain was part of the message. Your body belongs to whoever owns you, and they will modify it according to their preferences without regard for your comfort. The cosmetic preparation followed. Oil was rubbed into the skin to make it shine under display lighting. Substances were applied to the face to enhance complexion and hide minor blemishes. The hair was styled according to Roman preferences rather than Greek fashion. The overall effect was to make the woman look less like a Greek noblewoman and more like a Roman domestic slave, to erase the visual markers of her former identity and replace them with the appearance expected of merchandise. The physical preparation also included what the Roman sources describe as training for display. Captives were taught how to stand on the auction platform, how to turn when directed, how to hold their bodies in positions that showed them to best advantage. They were trained to respond to standard commands that buyers would use to inspect them, to move in ways that demonstrated physical capability without suggesting resistance or independence. This training was enforced through immediate consequences. Captives who did not comply with instructions were corrected. The sources described various methods, including physical restraint, deprivation of food or water, and more severe measures for persistent resistance. The goal was not merely to prepare the body, but to begin the psychological process of compliance training that would continue through the remaining stages. Cleomache learned the display positions and the standard responses. She learned because the alternative was to be restrained and positioned by force, which was both more painful and more damaging to the dignity she was trying to preserve. She learned because compliance in small things might allow her to maintain resistance in larger things. She learned because she had no other choice. The third stage was psychological processing techniques designed to reduce resistance and create the compliance that Roman buyers expected in high-value household slaves. This stage was particularly intensive for noblewomen, whose former status had given them habits of command and expectations of respect that were incompatible with their new position as property. For Cleomache, psychological processing began on her second day and continued through her third day in the facility. The techniques used were documented in Roman sources with a precision that reveals systematic development over generations. Dealers understood that physical coercion alone was insufficient. Buyers wanted slaves who complied willingly, or at least convincingly, rather than slaves who required constant supervision and force. Creating this compliance required psychological techniques that modern observers recognize as methods of identity, destruction, and reconstruction. The first technique was isolation. Cleomache was separated from the other noblewomen she had been processed with, placed alone in a cell where she had no human contact, except with the dealer's assistants who came to reinforce the processing. This isolation served multiple purposes. It prevented captives from supporting each other's resistance. It created psychological dependency on the only humans available for interaction, and it intensified the sense of helplessness that made other techniques more effective. The second technique was identity denial. Assistants were instructed never to use captives' names, never to acknowledge their former status, never to respond to assertions of identity or appeals based on who they had been. Cleomache was referred to only by a number 17, or by generic terms like the Greek or the merchandise. Every attempt she made to assert her identity as a person with a name, a history, a family was met with blank incomprehension or active denial. The third technique was status demonstration. Captives were required to perform tasks that confirmed their new status, cleaning their own cells, accepting food from bowls on the floor, responding to commands with formulaic expressions of compliance. Each task was designed to reinforce the message that their former status was gone, that they were now property subject to the will of whoever owned them. The fourth technique was uncertainty. Captives were not told when they would be sold, to whom they would be sold, what their future would hold. They were not told what had happened to family members captured with them. They were kept in a state of continuous anxiety about circumstances they could not control and could not obtain information about. This uncertainty created psychological exhaustion that reduced capacity for resistance. The fifth technique was witness to consequences. Captives who resisted processing were disciplined in ways that other captives could hear and sometimes see. The sounds of correction voices raised in command, sounds of physical contact, cries of pain communicated clearly what happened to those who did not comply. The message was unambiguous. Resistance produced suffering, compliance produced relief. Cleomache experienced all of these techniques across 48 hours of processing. She was isolated, denied identity, required to perform status-confirming tasks, kept in uncertainty about everything she cared about, and exposed to the sounds of other captives being corrected for resistance. By the end of the third day, she was ready for display. Not because her spirit was broken, some core of Cleomache remained intact beneath the compliance she had learned to perform, but because she had learned what the dealers needed her to learn, that visible resistance only made things worse, that compliance was the only strategy that offered any possibility of survival, that preserving herself required becoming what they wanted her to appear to be. The dealers called this state market-ready. Modern psychologists would call it the beginning of traumatic adaptation, the survival response that allows humans to function in circumstances of absolute powerlessness by suppressing the parts of themselves that cannot accept what is happening. The auction of captured noblewomen was a specialized event within the broader Roman slave market. Regular auctions of ordinary slaves happened frequently in major market centers, but auctions of high-value merchandise, educated women from conquered nations, trained household staff, individuals with specific skills or exceptional beauty were scheduled events that attracted wealthy buyers willing to pay premium prices. The auction where Cleomache was sold took place approximately 3 weeks after the fall of Corinth, in a temporary market established in what had been the city's agora. Roman buyers had traveled specifically for this auction, understanding that the conquest had produced merchandise that would not be available again. Greek noblewomen from one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world, educated and cultured in ways that Roman households valued. The display began at dawn on the auction day. Captives were arranged on platforms according to category, with noblewomen positioned prominently where their quality would be immediately visible to arriving buyers. Each captive bore a sign around her neck, the titulus that provided essential information: origin, age, skills, any disclosed defects, and the dealer's warranty terms. Cleomache's titulus read something like, Greek female, Corinth, 31 years, literate in Greek and Latin, household management experience, mother of 3, sold with standard warranty against hidden defects, reserve price on request. The display continued through the morning with potential buyers circulating among the platforms, examining merchandise, asking questions of the dealer's assistants, and indicating interest in particular lots. Buyers were permitted to inspect captives physically to examine teeth, feel muscle tone, assess flexibility, verify claims made on the titulus. This inspection happened publicly, on the platform, with other buyers and spectators watching. The Roman poet Martial describes such scenes in terms that emphasize the dehumanization. The dealer turns her, shows her from all sides, makes her walk, makes her stand, makes her demonstrate whatever skills the buyer wishes to verify. She complies because she has learned to comply, and her compliance itself is evidence that she has been properly prepared. The auction proper began at midday. An auctioneer worked through the lots in order of expected value, starting with less valuable merchandise and building toward the premium captives who would command the highest prices. The bidding was public, with buyers calling out offers that the auctioneer acknowledged and encouraged. Cleomache was sold in the late afternoon, after most of the other noblewomen had already been purchased. The bidding started at 8,000 denarii, a substantial sum that reflected her documented skills and noble background, and rose through competitive offers from multiple buyers. She was eventually purchased by a Roman senator named Lucius Aurelius Cotta for 12,000 denarii, approximately 4 times what the dealer had paid for her. She was removed from the platform immediately after the sale, transferred to the custody of Aurelius Cotta's household manager, and transported to Rome to begin her service in a household she had never seen, in a city she had never visited, in a role she had never imagined when she woke on the morning the walls of Corinth fell. Let me tell you now about 4 other women who went through this same system, women whose outcomes were different from Cleomache's, in ways that reveal the range of what the Roman slave trade produced. Berenice was the daughter of a Carthaginian senator, a member of one of the ruling families that had governed that city for generations before Rome's final destruction of Carthage in 146 years before the Common Era. She was 27 years old when the city fell, the mother of 2 daughters aged 6 and 4. The destruction of Carthage was more complete than the destruction of Corinth, which happened in the same year. The Roman Senate had ordered that Carthage be demolished entirely, its population dispersed, its very site cursed so that no city would ever rise there again. The survivors, those not killed in the final assault or the massacres that followed, were sold into slavery en masse, with dealers from across the Mediterranean converging on the ruins to purchase merchandise that would never be available again. Berenice was captured during the final assault on the citadel, where the remaining defenders had taken refuge. Her husband had died in the fighting. Her parents had died in the siege. Her daughters were with her when she was taken, clinging to her as soldiers separated them from the corpses of their relatives. The separation happened during initial processing. Berenice was classified as a high-value adult, educated, from a prominent family, physically undamaged. Her daughters were classified as children of moderate value, young enough to be trained for any purpose, but requiring years of feeding and housing before they would be productive. The dealer who purchased Berenice did not purchase her daughters. He purchased only merchandise in his specialty category. Her daughters were sold to a different dealer who specialized in children, transported to a different market, prepared for sale to different buyers. Berenice never saw her daughters again. The processing she underwent was similar to what Cleomache experienced. Bathing, grooming, cosmetic preparation, psychological processing designed to create compliance. But Berenice's processing included an additional element. She was required to watch as her daughters were led away, to understand that her compliance was the only thing that might create the possibility of learning what had happened to them. This technique, using family separation as leverage, was standard practice for the Roman slave trade. Captives who had family members in the system were more compliant than captives who had no such leverage against them. The possibility that good behavior might lead to information, might lead to contact, might eventually lead to reunion, motivated compliance, more effectively than any physical coercion. Berenice was sold to a household in Rome approximately 2 months after Carthage's fall. She served in that household for 11 years, demonstrating the excellence that her education and training had provided, earning the trust that exceptional slaves could achieve in Roman households. During those 11 years, she made exactly one inquiry about her daughters. The response was that such information was not available, that she should focus on her duties, that asking such questions again would be noted in her record. She never asked again. Modern historians who have studied Roman slavery estimate that family separation was the norm rather than the exception. Captives from the same family were typically sold to different buyers, dispersing family units across the Mediterranean world. The deliberate cruelty of this practice was understood by contemporaries. The Roman philosopher Seneca criticizes it specifically, but the commercial logic was clear. Slaves without family connections were easier to control than slaves who might prioritize family over service. Berenice died at approximately 43 years of age, still enslaved, never having learned what became of her daughters. The historical record does not indicate whether they survived to adulthood, whether they too died in slavery, or whether they lived their entire lives wondering what had happened to their mother. Theodora was a priestess of Artemis at a temple in Macedon, a religious position that conferred significant status in the Greek world. She was 34 years old when her city was captured during the Roman consolidation of the Macedonian territory in approximately 167 years before the Common Era. Her capture was specifically recorded because of her religious position, which made her a prize that Roman commanders believed would demonstrate their dominance over Greek religion as well as Greek politics. The processing that Theodora underwent was specifically designed to destroy her religious identity. The dealer who purchased her understood that her value would be enhanced if she could be presented as a former priestess, now reduced to the status of household property, a demonstration of Roman power over the gods themselves. The techniques used against Theodora targeted her specifically as a religious figure. She was required to verbally renounce her priesthood. She was required to perform acts that would have been forbidden to her in her religious role. She was required to state that the gods she had served were powerless to protect her, that her service to them had been meaningless, that her new masters were the only authority she recognized. These requirements were enforced through the same methods used on other captives: isolation, identity denial, witness to consequences, but with specific additions targeting her religious status. She was shown artifacts from her temple that had been looted and defaced. She was told that other priests and priestesses from her temple had died during or after the conquest. She was made to understand that everything she had dedicated her life to was gone, that the gods she had served had abandoned her, that compliance with her new owners was the only path that offered any future at all. Modern scholars recognize these techniques as specifically designed to induce what is now called religious deconversion trauma, the psychological devastation that occurs when deeply held religious beliefs are deliberately destroyed through systematic pressure. The Romans may not have understood the psychology in modern terms, but they understood empirically that destroying a priestess's religious identity was necessary before she could be successfully sold as domestic property. Theodora was sold to a household in Rome where she served for approximately 8 years. During that time, according to a reference in a later historical source, she never participated in any religious observance, never prayed, never made offerings, never acknowledged the gods she had once served or any other divine powers. The source that mentions her describes this absence of religious practice as evidence of the thoroughness with which her captors had destroyed her faith. But an alternative reading is possible. Perhaps Theodora's silence was not evidence of destroyed faith, but of faith gone underground, practiced only in the privacy of her own mind, where no observer could see it and no dealer could destroy it. She was freed in the will of her owner when he died approximately 8 years after her purchase. What she did with her freedom is not recorded. Whether she returned to religious practice, sought out other survivors of her temple, or lived the remainder of her life in the silence that captivity had taught her these questions, cannot be answered from the surviving sources. Arsinoe, was the wife of a military commander in the kingdom of Pontus, captured during the Roman campaigns against King Mithridates in approximately 71 years before the Common Era. She was 29 years old, renowned in her region for her beauty, and specifically targeted by Roman officers who understood that she would command an exceptional price in the slave markets. Unlike the other women I have described, Arsinoe chose to resist the processing. The resistance began during the physical preparation. When assistants attempted to begin the bathing procedures, she physically attacked the handlers, attempted to escape the bathing area, refused to cooperate with any aspect of the preparation. She was restrained, but her resistance continued. She refused to assume the display positions. She refused to respond to commands. She refused to perform the compliance behaviors that the psychological processing was designed to induce. The dealer who had purchased her, a man named Marcus Licinius Crassus, not the famous triumvir, but a freedman who shared the name, faced a business problem. Arsinoe's beauty and status made her potentially valuable merchandise, but her resistance made her unsaleable in her current condition. Buyers wanted compliant slaves, not captives, who would fight their new owners the way they were fighting the dealer's assistants. Crassus's response was to escalate the processing. The Roman sources describe various techniques used on resistant captives without providing detailed procedures. They mention extended isolation, deprivation of food and water, physical restraint in uncomfortable positions, exposure to cold or heat, and other methods of correction that the sources do not specify. The legal framework established limits on what dealers could do merchandise that was permanently damaged, had reduced value, but within those limits, dealers had substantial latitude to enforce compliance. Arsinoe's resistance lasted approximately 6 days. The sources describe her condition at the end of this period in terms that suggest significant physical and psychological deterioration, weight loss, signs of sleep deprivation, a demeanor that had changed from active defiance to passive withdrawal. She was sold approximately 10 days after her capture, at a price significantly below what her beauty and status might have commanded if she had been successfully prepared. The buyer was a provincial administrator who apparently valued the prestige of owning a Pontic noblewoman more than he required the compliance that domestic service would have demanded. What happened to Arsinoe in her new household is not recorded in detail. A later reference suggests that she died approximately 3 years after her sale, at approximately 32 years of age. The cause of death is not specified, but the context suggests that her resistance had never fully ended, that she had continued to fight in whatever ways remained available to her, until her body, or her circumstances no longer permitted, continued existence. Modern readers might see Arsinoe's story as heroic a woman who refused to accept enslavement, who fought until the end, who never became what her captors wanted her to become. And there is heroism in her resistance. But the Roman sources tell her story as a cautionary tale, a demonstration of what happened to captives who did not cooperate, whose resistance only made their situations worse without achieving any meaningful change in their circumstances. The system was designed to defeat resistance. The dealers had generations of experience with captives who fought. They had techniques that worked. Arsinoe's resistance did not break the system. The system broke her. Livia was captured during Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in approximately 52 years before the Common Era. She was the daughter of a tribal chieftain, approximately 23 years old. Part of the massive captive population that Caesar's campaigns produced, over 1 million Gauls, were reportedly killed or enslaved during the conquest, numbers that, even by Roman standards, were considered exceptional. The scale of the Gallic conquest created supply that exceeded demand. Prices for Gallic captives dropped sharply as markets were flooded with merchandise that dealers struggled to process and sell. The normal, careful preparation that valuable merchandise received was abbreviated or eliminated for many captives who were sold as quickly as possible to minimize the costs of feeding and housing them. Livia was caught between categories. She was noble enough to potentially command a premium price, but the market was too saturated for dealers to invest significantly in her preparation. She received abbreviated processing, basic cleaning and grooming, minimal psychological preparation, quick evaluation and display before being auctioned, along with dozens of other Gallic noblewomen who had been processed through the same facility. The auction was chaotic. Too many captives were being sold at once. Buyers could not evaluate merchandise carefully. Prices were depressed across all categories. Livia was sold for approximately 2,000 denarii, a fraction of what Cleomache had commanded in a more normal market, to a buyer who purchased her, along with several other women from the same lot. What followed reveals the variation in enslaved experience that the Roman system produced. Livia's buyer was a provincial merchant rather than a wealthy Roman household. The service expected of her was more physical, less refined than what women sold to senatorial households experienced. She worked in the merchant's commercial operations, handling goods and dealing with customers in ways that women sold to aristocratic households would never have been required to do. But the merchant's household was also less formal, less hierarchical, less invested in maintaining the elaborate distinctions that aristocratic slavery required. Livia apparently developed what the sources describe as a working relationship with her owner, a term that suggests something between the dehumanizing formality of aristocratic slavery and genuine partnership. She was freed after approximately 15 years of service, when her owner's business failed and his assets were sold to pay creditors. Freed slaves in this situation typically received nothing. Freedom was granted to reduce the number of people the former owner was obligated to support, not as a reward or acknowledgement. But Livia had apparently maintained connections with Gallic communities in the region, had perhaps helped Gallic traders navigate the Roman commercial system, had created networks that she could draw upon once freed. A later reference indicates that she established herself as a small trader in her own right, operating in the same markets where she had once been sold. Her story is not triumphant. 15 years of slavery, followed by a precarious freedom, is not a happy ending, but it suggests possibilities that the stories of Cleomache and Berenice and Theodora and Arsinoe do not. Some enslaved women found ways to survive that preserved something of themselves, that allowed them to emerge from slavery with resources and connections that made independent life possible. The Roman system destroyed most of the women who passed through it, but not all of them. And the exceptions, the women who found ways to survive and eventually thrive, deserve to be remembered alongside those who did not. The processing of captive women through the Roman slave trade is documented in multiple categories of surviving evidence. Legal sources provide the most detailed information about standard practices. The Roman legal corpus includes extensive discussion of slave sales, including the warranties dealers were required to provide, the disclosures they were required to make, the procedures for disputing sales when merchandise proved defective. These legal texts describe the physical examinations, the display procedures, the information recorded on the titulus, and other aspects of the trade with precision that suggests standardized practices across the Mediterranean world. Literary sources provide descriptions of slave markets and processing facilities that confirm the legal evidence while adding vivid detail. Poets like Martial and Ovid describe auctions, display platforms, the examination of merchandise by potential buyers. Philosophers like Seneca criticize the dehumanization of the trade while inadvertently documenting its practices. Historians like Polybius and Diodorus describe the massive enslaving operations that followed military conquests, providing context for the scale of the trade. Archaeological evidence confirms the physical infrastructure. Excavations at Delos have revealed the remains of slave market facilities, including holding cells, processing areas, and display platforms that match the descriptions in literary sources. Similar evidence has been found at other major trading centers, suggesting consistent practices across the Roman world. Epigraphic evidence inscriptions on stone and metal provides information about individual slaves and their origins, fates, and sometimes the prices paid for them. These inscriptions allow historians to track the movement of enslaved populations from conquest to sale to eventual disposition, whether through death in slavery, manumission, or other outcomes. Modern scientific analysis adds new categories of evidence. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains can identify individuals who grew up in different regions than where they died, confirming the long-distance movement of enslaved populations that literary sources describe. DNA analysis can identify family relationships among remains, revealing patterns of family separation and dispersal. Pathological analysis can identify physical trauma and health conditions consistent with enslaved labor. The weight of evidence makes the Roman slave trade one of the best documented forced labor systems in ancient history. Scholars have debated the scale estimates of the total enslaved population range from 2 million to 10 million or more, but the practices themselves are not seriously disputed. What the dealers did to captive noblewomen is documented in sources that the perpetrators themselves created, sources that have been available to scholars for centuries. Modern psychologists and trauma researchers who have analyzed the Roman slave processing techniques recognize methods that remain effective for inducing compliance and destroying resistance today. The isolation techniques that dealers used match what is now called coercive isolation, separation from support networks that normally help individuals maintain psychological stability. The identity denial techniques match methods used in what is now called identity coercion, systematic attack on the beliefs, relationships, and self-concepts that allow individuals to maintain a stable sense of who they are. The uncertainty techniques that kept captives anxious about their circumstances match what trauma researchers call unpredictable stress, exposure to threatening situations that cannot be anticipated or controlled, which produces chronic activation of stress responses that eventually exhaust psychological resources. The witness to consequences techniques match what is now called vicarious traumatization, exposure to others' suffering as a method of inducing compliance through fear. The overall effect of these techniques, the progressive reduction of resistance, the creation of compliance that appeared willing rather than forced, matches what modern researchers call traumatic adaptation. This is the psychological process by which individuals, in situations of absolute powerlessness, learn to survive by suppressing the parts of themselves that cannot accept what is happening. Traumatic adaptation is not the same as acceptance. People who experience it often maintain internal resistance that is invisible to their captors. Beliefs, memories, hopes that persist beneath the compliance that survival requires. But traumatic adaptation does create the behaviors that the Roman dealers were trying to produce. External compliance, reduced resistance, the appearance of acceptance that buyers expected. Modern research suggests that traumatic adaptation has long-term psychological consequences that the Roman dealers likely did not understand. Survivors of prolonged captivity often experience depression, anxiety, difficulty forming relationships, and other symptoms that persist long after the captivity itself has ended. The psychological damage inflicted during processing likely continued affecting these women throughout their lives, regardless of their subsequent circumstances. The Roman dealers did not know or care about long-term psychological consequences. They cared about producing saleable merchandise. The techniques they developed worked for that purpose. And the fact that these techniques worked reveals something disturbing about human psychology. Given sufficient pressure, most people can be made to comply with almost anything. For Cleomache of Corinth, who was 31 years old when her city fell, who was processed through techniques designed to destroy her identity and create compliance, who was sold to a Roman senator for 12,000 denarii, who spent the rest of her life serving in a household she had never chosen, who never again saw the children she was separated from during the initial sorting after the conquest. For Berenice of Carthage, who was 27 years old when her city was destroyed, who watched her daughters led away to a different dealer and a different market and a different fate, who served for 11 years in a Roman household without ever learning what became of them, who died still wondering. For Theodora of Macedon, who was 34 years old and a priestess when she was captured, whose religious identity was specifically targeted for destruction, who served for 8 years in silence that might have been broken faith, or might have been faith preserved in the only way that remained possible. For Arsinoe of Pontus, who was 29 years old when she was captured, who chose to resist when others complied, who fought until the system broke her, who died approximately 3 years later in circumstances that suggest her resistance never fully ended. For Livia of Gaul, who was 23 years old when she was captured, who was processed in abbreviated fashion because the market was flooded with captives like her, who served for 15 years before being freed into poverty, who somehow found ways to survive and eventually establish herself as an independent trader. For the millions of women who passed through the Roman slave trade across centuries of conquest and commerce. For the noblewomen who commanded premium prices and the common women who were sold in bulk lots. For the mothers separated from children and the daughters separated from parents. For the priestesses whose faith was attacked and the wives whose families were destroyed. For everyone who stood naked on an auction platform while strangers evaluated their bodies and bid for ownership of their lives. They were not commodities. They were human beings, women with names and histories and relationships and hopes that the Roman system was designed to erase. They became commodities only through systematic violence applied by dealers who had refined their techniques across generations. They did not choose slavery. They were captured, processed, sold, and used according to the needs and desires of people who never asked their consent for anything that happened to them. Their compliance was not acceptance. It was survival adaptation, the only response available to people in situations of absolute powerlessness. They deserved better. They deserved to live free in the cities of their birth. They deserved to raise their children and serve their gods and die among people who knew their names. They deserved to be remembered as people rather than as merchandise. This is what the Roman slave dealers did to captured noblewomen before the auction. This is what the processing facilities were for not storage, not simple holding, but systematic transformation of free people into compliant property through techniques designed to destroy identity and create compliance. This is what the Roman sources document in their own words, in their own records, in evidence that has been available to scholars for centuries. The processing facilities are gone now. The dealers are dust. The techniques have not been used in their original form for over 1,500 years. But the patterns persist. The methods that the Roman dealers developed: isolation, identity attack, uncertainty, witness to consequences. Traumatic adaptation appear in different forms wherever humans attempt to reduce other humans to property or tools. The Roman system was particularly systematic, particularly documented, particularly effective. But it was not unique, and somewhere, in museum collections around the world, there are artifacts from the Roman slave trade, chains that bound captive bodies, collars that marked enslaved necks, inscriptions that recorded sales and prices, and the names of people who were sold. Physical evidence of a system that processed millions of human beings through facilities designed to transform them into merchandise. They deserve to be remembered, not as merchandise, not as commodities, not as the compliant property that the dealers tried to create. as Cleomache, as Berenice, as Theodora, as Arsinoe, as Livia, as the women they were before the dealers took them. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand Roman civilization, but has only learned about the marble and the philosophy. The empire ran on slavery. The slavery ran on processing. The processing was designed to destroy human beings and create property. Remember them. Remember what was done to them. Remember,